For about 2.5 years, I ran and produced a podcast called the Southbound Startup Podcast. And in it, I interviewed entrepreneurs, startups. We did articles, we did news, we did all kinds of things. And it ran through actually 6 different seasons. And I enjoyed the process a lot. But if you've ever thought about starting your own podcast, I'm going to give you some real feedback. It can be a lot to do. If you're producing other content like blogs and courses and books, and you're doing a podcast, it can be a lot to keep up with, particularly if you were doing like I was and you're interviewing other people. Just arranging for those interviews and that type of process can be quite a bit to deal with. And so after about 2.5 years of the podcast, I decided to go ahead and close it down for a while. Well, I'm actually reconsidering bringing it back. Matter of fact, I'm pretty sure I'm going to, and my goal is to bring it back by June 1st, 2020. I've already started processing some podcast episodes, re-recording some of the old interviews and getting those ready so that folks like you who are enjoying the channel can also check out the content through another avenue, through a podcast, when we all get back to commuting to our offices and schools and things like that. But today I want to share with you a couple of podcasts that I took a look at in my research to bring back the Southbound Startup Podcast. I wanted to see what other podcasts were doing in the entrepreneur and startup space. So today I'm going to share with you 4 or 5 of those that I found that I thought were interesting. I wanted to use an abundance mentality and think through the fact that it's okay if there's other startup podcasts that you're listening to. I wanted to share those resources with you if I got value in them. So let's get right to it. Let's take a look at some of those startup podcasts that I think you should check out and listen to. The first startup podcast that I want to share with you is probably the grandfather of them all. Now, it may not be the longest running, but this particular podcast is what kicked off and started a company called Gimlet Media. You can see their name here on the website. And this particular startup podcast is what got them the most attention. Now, they produce other shows, but this podcast is actually part of the reason that Spotify bought them out. And it's a really interesting podcast. One of the things that I like about it is it is highly edited and highly produced. And you would think that would happen with a company that's producing lots of different shows, and this is their business model. So I love the amount of effort that goes into the podcast. Lots of cool and interesting editing, things that I'm jealous of and wish I had the time to do for you. But now, on the flip side of that, I will be honest with you and tell you that this podcast never really caught my attention, and I've not been able to put my hand on why that is. While I love the editing and the structure of things, and they do share really interesting content, there's just been something about the guests on there that have never really grabbed my attention. And so I encourage you to check it out yourself, have your own opinion of it, see what you think about it. But this is one of the most well-known startup podcasts out there. It would be the benchmark that any podcast that is coming into the market would want to compete against if you were really concerned about carving out market share just from a podcast and media perspective. Lots and lots of episodes. It looks like they've slowed down a little bit. They're not producing as many as they used to, but really good, interesting one to check out. Now, the first startup podcast that I discovered back in 2010 when I was first launching my startup was Twist, or This Week in Startups, by Jason Calacanis. And Jason is a very well-known angel investor, frankly, very opinionated, which makes some of the episodes really interesting. But what I like about his podcast is that it's not just about interviewing other entrepreneurs and startups. It's that Jason takes the time to educate people on what it's like to be an angel investor, the things he looks for in a startup. He approaches these interviews from an investor perspective, and he has interviewed some of the startups he's put money into. But even when he hasn't, he approaches these interviews from a startup investor perspective. So if you're looking to sort of learn more about that, check out this podcast, This Week in Startups by Jason Calacanis. Side note, Jason also wrote a book about how to get started in angel investing. So if that's something that intrigues you as well, I would encourage you to go Google it and check it out. There are a lot of well-known accelerators out there. You have Y Combinator, Techstars. 500 Startups is another, probably in the top 5 popularity accelerator, and they have produced a podcast as well. So go Google 500 Startups and you can find their podcast. They do a nice job of also interviewing startups and approaching it more from the accelerator perspective. So talking about, in my opinion, and discussing things that are appropriate for startups that are going into accelerators, what they look for startups that are wanting to apply to accelerators, those types of things. So if you're looking for that perspective from the startup world, I would encourage you to check out 500 Startups. Now, I want to share this one with you, and I don't think these folks are recording anymore, because if I look through, the episodes are still available to you if I look through them. But it looks like it's been a while since they've been posting them. But, that makes sense with the name of the podcast. So it's called Bootstrapped with Kids. Bootstrap meaning when you're trying to grow a business, trying to grow a startup without taking outside funding, you're just running on your own dime trying to grow it. And these guys, actually, you can tell they're pretty tongue-in-cheek and pretty out there. They produced a podcast that talked about what it's like to try and grow a business, to try and grow a startup while you're growing a family, while you're going about normal life. And so, unfortunately, they're not recording anymore. But it looks like they've still got some of the episodes out there that you could check out. And I just love the name of it, Bootstrap with Kids, because it's a reality from a perspective of someone. If you're like me and you've got a family, you're trying to grow a business and, those kinds of things, this type of insight can be really helpful to make you realize you're not alone. You don't have to be a young 20-year-old to grow a startup. That you can balance both family and business and benefit from both. And then the last one I want to share with you is going to be much more closer to the Southbound Startup podcast, because they're just north of me, about 2 hours in Kentucky. I found this group when I got involved with Startup Lexington. I've been connecting with that group on a regular basis. One of their members, Madison, shared with me this podcast. The name's a little confusing to me, so I don't really follow where they're going with this, but it's called Middle Tech Podcast, and they're still producing the show. You can see what they do is very similar to the Southbound Startup Podcast. They're interviewing and doing news and articles and things like that from startups and entrepreneurs from their particular area, which would be Kentucky. I imagine if you flip through some of these companies are going to be outside of Kentucky, maybe in the South, those types of things, but they do focus at least in their area, and they're regularly producing one a week. You can see here, the last one was published 3 days ago. One a week, they're producing podcast episodes that you can check out. So a couple of really cool startup podcasts to check out if you're like me, if you like to sort of catch the news while you're driving, or when we all get back to that, right? Or when you're sitting around doing some chores with your AirPods in, listening to a podcast, learning along the way, hearing best practices from other startups. A couple of podcasts that you can check out and sample, see if you like them, maybe even subscribe if you do. I really hope when the Southbound Startup podcast comes back, we'll put a link to it here. When the Southbound podcast comes back, you'll check it out and subscribe. I'm going to be sharing some interviews I've done in the past, recording new ones, sharing updates, and some of the articles and videos that I do for you here on YouTube. Until next time, the next episode, I will be talking about what to look for in a startup community. I hope you'll join me then. Until then, take care. See ya.